Welcome to the Bridge the Gap podcast. Here's your host, Dustin Udke.
Welcome in, everybody. Did you know that when you decide to rebuild in Dynasty is just as important of making that decision to begin with? And that's what we're going to talk about tonight is when should you make the decision to rebuild or go all in your Dynasty League. We're going to talk all things rebuild, kind of reframe what rebuild is. And I couldn't think of a better person to have this conversation with than my good friend, Tommy Blair. He is the co-host of the Superflex Super Show. Tommy, welcome in. How are you tonight?
Man, I'm doing so great. I really appreciate the invite. I'm a listener since episode 1. I think this is a really cool show. What you're trying to accomplish is something that this space needs. And it's great to be invited. I'm really excited to see where the conversation goes.
Yeah, of course I wanted to have you on. I think I texted you when I first launched the show, like, hey, you're on my short list. And the conversations we're having on this podcast is what I've been doing is just gearing the conversations around the people I want to have on. And you are an underrated person in the space because you think of things differently. And we've had lots of conversations about the way things are thought of and the way they probably should be thought of like super flex leagues doesn't mean you start two quarterbacks. It's perceived value, not actual value, that's not the optimal thing. And so we're going to talk redraft. And we talked a little before the show, like making the decision to rebuild is an important decision, but when you make it is super important. So before we get into that, Tommy, tell everybody where they can find you and what you got going on.
Yeah, so like you said, I'm the co-host of the Superflex Super Show. We talk all things Superflex, among other strategies and flim-flams. I used to be on Dynasty Junkies. I actually just left Dynasty Junkies, but it's such a great listen. I encourage y'all to continue to follow along on Twitter at FFTommyB. And we actually started up a Discord on the Superflex Super Show. So go ahead and jump in there. We've got a few listener leagues. So we're talking about that. We're talking about different strategies that we're incorporating into the season. And there's no better time to have several hundred like-minded folks to talk about fantasy with, because there's a lot of moves to be made right now. One of them is, are we going to be moving our teams into rebuilds? Are we contenders? Are we somewhere in the middle? And how do we deal with that fact of being in the middle?
Yeah, I completely agree. And we'll put the Discord in the description of the show later, or we'll drop it in the comment. If you're watching right now on Twitter, come over to the Bridge the Gap YouTube, hop in the comments. We love his live comments. Maybe we'll answer some questions if we got time. If you're thinking about whether you want to rebuild or not, just give us your lineup and we'll tell you whether we think you should rebuild. And we'll go from there. So, Tom, before we get started with that conversation, we start most shows off with a game.
What exactly is the game?
Well, it is not a quiz or a trivia contest, nor is it a test of brute strength or athleticism. At its core, it's just a children's game, and I would wager that some of you here this evening have played Would You Rather?
We got a classic Would You Rather, a classic game here on Bridge the Gap. So we're talking about rebuild, and part of that is points for and what you're scoring. So, Tommy, would you rather win by 1 point every week? So every week you are eking out a win. It's you got to come down to the wire. You win by 1 point every week. Or would you rather be the highest scorer and then 1 week and then the lowest scorer the next, and it alternates every other week? So 1 week you're the highest scorer in the league, the next week you're the lowest scorer.
Yeah, I would certainly rather win every single week given the choice. However, that really does challenge your ceiling. So I would want to understand where my league mates were at. Are we all sort of in this type of milieu where we're struggling somewhere, let's say at 150 point range every week, and the worst score is at 120 and the best score is at 170? That matters a lot because we play in the regular season, yes, to win, but this is all angling for position in the playoffs, hopefully to get a bye. If you get one of the top 2 seeds, you usually don't have to play the first round of your fantasy playoffs. That just about doubles your chances of winning a championship, and it exponentially increases your odds of winning money. And so if I can make the playoffs and have those odds of having maybe the highest score every other week, I kind of like those odds. However, I would rather just make the playoffs and hope that I could somehow spin the dice a different way come playoff time, maybe change up my strategy a little bit. But Dustin, I imagine you have some thoughts behind this question.
I do. For me, it's, and I will preface this, like I when I thought of this question, it was in the terms of just the regular season, not the fantasy playoffs. I don't love the stress of going into Monday night with this close matchup and you're watching it and it's, teeter-tottering and you're maybe in the odd percentage is, 50-50 or 49 and then it keeps going back and forth. I love it when I score the most points. I really do. It's just like tip of the cap. I started the right players, which I think for me is always the biggest conundrum in fantasy football of your sit-start decisions, especially those flex plays. It always stinks to have those guys on your bench that score 30, 40 points. If you score the highest points every other week, and let's say you play 14 weeks, you're only going to have 7 wins. That doesn't get you into the playoffs. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but 7 wins doesn't get you in the playoffs. So if you're the highest scorer and then the lowest scorer, you're just not going to make the playoffs. And you need to make the playoffs if you want to win money. Now, I'm a firm believer that fantasy should be fun, and winning is not necessarily the only way to have fun. Winning certainly is fun, but there's other ways of having fun in fantasy. And I've had seasons where I've, gone into this multi-year strategy or tanking or whatever you want to call it. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And that was the most fun I've ever had making trades. So if I know that I'm only going to win 7 games, maybe I just, for 1 year, just have fun and make trades and do some other stuff, acquire the players I want for the next year. This is just a 1-year thing, not every year. But I do think you're right. I think knowing that you can make the playoffs and get that bye, it does help you win and then make some and win money, which is you put money into these leagues. Theoretically, you need to win usually once every 6 or 7 years to break even in most of your league payout structures. So I will take if you told me this was just for 1 year, I will take the 1 point every week and win for 1 year. Because then the rest of if I can win the championship and that sets me up for a better chance of winning the championship, and I can just be good and break even for 7 years, I'm okay with that.
It is kind of great when you do eke out those wins. I know they're stressful.
Yeah.
My wife, she's in her first year ever playing dynasty or fantasy football, and she just lost 2 games. She's in 3 leagues. She just lost 2 games by less than a point. And I just had to tell her, like, it comes around. You're going to get one of these coming your way some point later in the season. I know this sucks right now, but like, just keep working through this, because if you're this close, that means you probably have a competitive team.
Yeah. If you're that close, and I think for me, it's when you're winning by 1 point, you're probably slightly above the league average, which, if you play with league median, that's also important because that's 2 wins instead of 1. It is always nerve-wracking, but it is nice. It's, not as nice as maybe winning by a stack correction because I've had those wins before, and that's like you think you lost, and it's like a magical surprise. It's like finding $20 in your coat pocket when winter rolls around. But you gotta win. At some point, you can't go forever and not win. If at some point in your fantasy career over a 5 to 7 year window, if you're not in a place where you can win, you need to figure something out. You need to change things up. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about tonight. Like, how do you get to the point where if you're consistently bad or you're bad right now, when do you decide to kind of shift your focus and move forward? So, Tommy, to explain the difference between a rebuild and maybe like a retooling, because I think those are 2 different terms we hear out there in the fantasy space. And if you guys are watching, drop your comments what you'd rather do, win by 1 point every week or have the highest and lowest. But tell us what the difference between a rebuild and a retooling is.
I think it's open for interpretation, right? I guess if you asked 100 different dynasty managers what they thought, you might get 60 or 70 different answers. But to me, it means something very specific. Retooling means that I am remaining open to the possibility of winning in the given year that I'm in. So 2024, we're into what, week 2, week 3 right now.
Yep.
If I'm retooling, I have an eye towards the future. Yes, I'm making moves where I'm positioning myself to be maybe a stronger contender in 2025 than I may be in 2024. But I have not closed the door on a playoff berth and possibly making some money this year. When I'm rebuilding, I've shut that door. I've said my first meaningful game is week 1 of 2025, and I'm going to act accordingly. I'm going to step back, and I'm playing a different game than the rest of my league mates, very likely, to where they're dealing with weekly variance. They're dealing with very important short-term windows, whereas I have, 12 months, 11 months until my next meaningful game. I can operate as almost an entirely different species than the other 11 managers. But Dustin, what do you think? What do these words mean to you?
To me, a rebuild is everyone on the team, except for maybe 2 or 3 players, is up for grabs. And when I say that, I don't mean we sell them cheap. We just tell them at market price or better with an eye towards the future. To me, a retool is a rethinking of my strategy of how I build my team. So a lot of times you have these strategies of I'm a zero RB guy and I'm going to just roll out there with, platooning, you know, a Zamir White and a Devin Singletary, and I'll just, I have four guys that could all be in there depending on matchups. And to me, retooling is okay. This strategy hasn't worked. I'm going to retool and go get a hero RB. Or I've been a streamer of quarterbacks or a streamer of tight ends, and that hasn't worked. So I'm going to go out. I'm going to change my philosophy of how I build my team and how I construct it, and what tools I have in my tool belt in terms of starting my lineup. And I'm going to change focus and go, okay, this strategy of building my team this way hasn't worked. I'm going to go out and make some changes that way. That for me is a retooling. It's a restructuring of how I build my teams.
I think that's really an important distinction, and one that doesn't get talked about enough, in
Yeah.
that you can't use the same strategy to the same success year over year. Even though the player names may change, you can't say, I'm an elite QB guy and I am
Yeah.
going to not care about wide receivers. I'm going to prioritize elite tight ends. Like that's just
Yeah.
one strategy, right? Well, that doesn't work every single year. Even though
No.
you may have elite tight ends, you may not care about wide receivers. You may have elite quarterbacks, because we're looking at the early reveal of this season and what's happening. 70% cover two shell defenses have really limited the offensive production in the passing game. And so should we be adapting right now? Should we be prioritizing rushing quarterbacks over passing quarterbacks? Does Patrick Mahomes matter as much as he always has? I think those are up for debate. I personally think Patrick Mahomes does matter and will continue to matter to nearly the same degree. And so I'm willing to challenge those stances at this point in the year and change some of them where the information is coming in and telling us, hey, we need to adapt, y'all.
Yeah, I mean, look at elite tight end this year. If you were I have Travis Kelce and I've had him for the past 5 years and he's been my rock and he's carried my team. He's not carrying your team this year. So maybe you need to look at that and retool and go, okay, can I turn a Travis Kelce into, a Dallas Goddard and, a wide receiver piece or a pick or something like that, and tier down, but collect more assets that are going to produce so much. And you go, hey, I have Travis Kelce and I have no second flex spot, but can I turn Travis Kelce into a just as good tight end in a flex spot that's going to accrue more points than Travis Kelce in this scrub on my flex spot? And that's what I think retooling is. Whereas rebuilding, I'm willing to tear this down to the studs. I maybe identify 2 or 3 cornerstone pieces, and then I'm going to rebuild. Tommy, to you, when we talk rebuilding, how long do you think that should take for a dynasty owner? Because I think we get a lot of talk of like, oh, I'm rebuilding. How long do you think that should take for someone?
We almost mythologize rebuilding a
We
little
do.
bit in the dynasty space, where you sell off every asset with any value, you get draft picks, you make the right picks, and you come out of these out of the fog with this army of contending pieces that are all 23 years old. That's not really how it typically works. If it does for you, like, that is awesome. You're
Yeah.
a really good manager. You're great at drafting rookies, whatever. That is not how I tend to rebuild, because A, I'm not good at selecting rookies, and B, I think there are more efficient ways and quicker turnarounds. What I would recommend folks do is a few things. One, give yourself a deadline. This is the date in which I want to compete, and then you work backwards from there. Say, what do I need in order to consider myself a contender, and how can I find a way to acquire those assets? You don't have to have names associated with them, but if you say, my strategy is to have 20 running backs and 6 wide receivers, okay, how am I going to build my team to where it's going to be effective in that roster construction? Secondly, if you are rebuilding, this is a great opportunity to step back and look at the transactions that are occurring amongst your league mates, because that's going to be the template moving forward for future moves. You're going to be wading back into those waters at some point, and so it's an opportunity to understand your league mates, understand their blind spots, their blunders, their biases, to take advantage of those. That is also going to determine your runway. You could be the best fantasy manager in the world, but you're still dependent on trading with your league mates, on their own missteps, on competing with them on waivers, in the drafts themselves. And so you need to take a moment to really learn your league mates when you're doing one of these rebuilds, because it can either accelerate or it can slow down whatever your timeline looks like. How do you build your own sort of runway, so to speak, for rebuilding?
I look at it at a 2 to 3 year window max if I'm rebuilding. The way I look at it is I go, okay, these are my 2 or 3 cornerstone pieces. I'm going to try to accrue assets in the next 2 years of drafts. That first year of draft is acquire 2 to 3 other cornerstone pieces. So now you have 4 to 6, hopefully 6 or more. And then that third year, so you have a year where you acquire picks. That second year was your first draft. That second draft is really where you are filling out your starting lineup and you are at least contending. You might not be a strong contender, but at least you're in the middle. And then that third draft for me is really when you're like, okay, these are the pieces now that I have pieces and I have the assets where I have not just a great starting team, but I have depth as well. And I'll say this, I think when rebuilding, we talk about it. It's all like, I've got these draft picks. I'm going to draft these young guys. A draft pick is not necessarily, you don't have to draft players with that. That's not what it is. It's an asset.
Yep.
And so what I did in a dynasty league this year was last year I drafted CJ Stroud. I got Puka Nacua, Tank Dell. I already had Amon-Ra St. Brown from the year before. And I went out and I had a first round pick and I could have taken someone. And I ended up taking my first and second and turned that into Jahmyr Gibbs. Those assets for me were better off going that route of getting someone that I knew was a higher commodity than drafting a Jonathan Brooks and waiting. And
Yep.
so I'm in a much better place now because I have a proven asset and I didn't look as picks as someone if I get a 2025 first, doesn't mean I have to draft someone with that 25 first. It has a monetary value in the ecosystem of my league. What do I use that money for? Do I use it on a rookie or do I use it for a known commodity? So for me, a rebuild really is a 2 to 3 drafts worth of years. So 3 years of 1 year of basically acquiring picks, 2 drafts, and that third draft after that third draft, you should be a contender for the title, not just making the playoffs. And that's where I think these assets are important because a draft pick is only good if you know how to draft. And you draft well and you consistently can pick out players or you're listening to the right people who are helping you pick the right players because we've seen plenty of bust. A Bryce Young, a, you know, who else was out there? Kenny Pickett,
Mac
Trey
Jones.
Lance,
Yeah.
Mac Jones. Like there's plenty of guys out there who have just, N'Keal Harry, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Those missteps can, yes, and you have to have room to allow yourself to make some mistakes. But if you're consistently making multiple mistakes, maybe that's where you don't use those picks to actually pick players. You get known commodities because you know what you're getting. Know your strengths, know your weaknesses when it looks to player evaluations and player acquisition, and what works for you. If you're good at picking out wide receivers, then get known running backs and select wide receivers in the draft. If you have seen that you are good at identifying tight ends, then get the other positions that you're not good at identifying. And that's what I look at when I'm building my runway for a rebuild. If someone says to me like, "Oh, I've been rebuilding. I'm in my second rebuild in 5 years," it's like, well, you just have been rebuilding the whole time. Again, you need to rethink your strategy of how you're rebuilding because that's not working.
Yeah. And as you tear these teams down, only open up holes you feel comfortable that you can backfill, right? So if you're terrible at drafting or picking or trading for quarterbacks, maybe don't sell your quarterbacks, Let's hold on to, I don't know, CJ Stroud. You mentioned CJ Stroud. Let's hold on to him instead of trying to split him into multiple assets in a rebuild. If you're not good at this, don't expose your weaknesses, right? And
Yes.
we're kind of in a golden age of data right now in fantasy football.
Oh, yeah.
To where other folks, you don't have to be a mathematician, you don't have to be a data analyst to be able to leverage some of these concepts either. There are folks like Jordan McNamara, Analytics of Dynasty, the football guys, the South Harmon folks. We could name probably 20 different folks, Adiko, who have figured out, this is essentially the hit rate, the likelihood of a top 12 or 24 performance at any point in their career in a 3-year span of these different draft picks. So if you have the 101 or the 106 or the 212, you can almost turn it into a bit of a math problem saying, what can I get for this 212 versus what are the odds of me having any success with this draft pick? And you can take away the player names, so to speak, and you can turn these draft picks into profiles or leverage opportunities in the veteran market. And that's something that I try to do because the last rookie pick I took was Quentin Johnston, Bryce Young. I took both of those. It's just like, I'm not good at this. And I'm willing to recognize that because I'm not a college football guy. I'm not a scout. But what I can do is look at numbers and make better sense of them than what my eyes are telling me of whether or not Bryce Young is any good at football. And to be honest, the NFL isn't any good at it either because they took him 101, didn't they?
Well, and I think that's the big thing is, and we're going to have a conversation about this later in the year of like, admitting you're wrong is not bad. Like, it's okay to admit you're wrong. It's okay to recognize that you have mistakes and you have weaknesses and finding the people and surround yourself with all the information that's out there that can help support your weaknesses and fill in that gap for you and as bridge the gap for you. That's what they're for. That's why people like me and you and the footballers and those guys out there go out there and people at Dynasty Bros go out and we do all this information. We don't just do it for ourselves. We put it out there so people have it. We want you guys to have the information. We want to help you guys. I don't need to tell you right now that CJ Stroud's good, right? I don't. No one's out there going, "Is CJ Stroud good?" You know that it's what does the outlook look for CJ down the run? Here's some metrics that showed up. Here's some system. Hey, is Drake May going to be good? Well, here's what I think based on what the coaching system is, right? Is JJ McCarthy? We'll talk about him later. Like, is he going to be good? Well, let's talk about what the system and Kevin O'Connell has done with quarterbacks and what that projects to look like, so you can make an educated decision based on more information. We need more data. We need more information and more data points so we can make more informed decisions. It's okay to go, I thought Bryce Young was good based on the data I had. Now you have a year and 2 games worth of data of him playing the NFL and go, okay, new data shows he's not good. And admitting that that's okay and you made a mistake is worthy of doing. I think that's something that we all need to be better at. So the big question, Tommy, is when should a dynasty manager make the decision of rebuild or not?
Oh, what a question. It's such a topical question as well, because we're in the time of year where I think folks are making these decisions. Don't you, Dustin?
I don't think they are yet, and I think they should be.
Yeah, well, there's a theory that the quickest dog to the bowl gets the most kibble. And I think there is some merit to that. If you're going to not retool, you're not going to remain open to some form of contendership this year. If you're going to rebuild, getting there first isn't a bad idea. Getting there second also isn't a bad idea. You certainly don't want to be any further than that in turning from competing into rebuilding. And so you need to almost play chicken with your league mates and say, like, all right, has anyone else jumped in the deep end yet? Am I going to be quickly following them? If not, I probably need to persevere longer than everyone else that pushes into a rebuild, because I don't know if you've seen this, Dustin, but it's kind of a race to sell off contending assets once the first or second person does. And a lot of value gets stripped away. And so I don't typically attribute a week to it. You and I were talking off air. There are certainly numbers that we can pull from. There are wins and losses stacking up. And I imagine you're going to get into that here in just a second, because those do matter. Like, eventually you do have to have about a 500 record to have a 50-50 shot of getting into the playoffs. If you're playing 14 weeks, 7-7 is about a 50% chance of getting in. You really probably need to have 8 wins in order to feel fairly assured that you're going to be in the playoffs. Otherwise, hanging around the middle can be a significant challenge. But if you have 4, 5, 6 managers all quitting on the season, you're a playoff team by default. And so you need to embrace that as well. But Dustin, I want to hear your thoughts, because I heard some of them off air and they're very compelling.
Yeah, I think week 4 is the latest you should make the decision on rebuild or not. And I think week 3 is the telling point. If you play 14 weeks, like you said, you need 7 wins is 50-50. I think it's even less than that. I think you're looking at 8 or 9 wins. Let's say you need 9 wins to get into the playoffs. You're playing 14 weeks. At week 4, that is a third of your season, 4 weeks. You've gone let's say you've gone 2-2 or 1-2. Let's say you've gone 2-2. I think if you're 3-1 or 4-0, you're good. If you're sitting at 2-2 at the end of week 4, you now have 10 weeks left, and you need to get 7 wins in 10 weeks. So you need to go 7-3 over the next 10 weeks to make the playoffs when you've just gone 2-2. That's a gut check moment right there.
Yeah.
So I look at that. I go, okay, where am I at? I'm 2-2. Now you may be the 5th place team out of 6 that make the playoffs, and it depends on if you have 6 make playoffs or 8. If I'm going to say you're a 12-team league and 6 make the playoffs, or a 10-team and 6 makes the playoff. Either way, 6 makes the playoff. You need 9 wins. Can I get 9 wins? Can I get 7 if I'm 2-2, or 8 if I'm 1-3 in the next 9 to 10 weeks? Probably not. This is where I look at points for in my league. Where do I stand in the points for? If I am in 6 or higher, probably 5th or higher in points for, I say you go for a win now, and I think you have a good shot. If you're lower than 5th in total points for, you're just not scoring enough points to get wins. You're just not. Like, even if you max out your points every week, you're probably just not getting there. Now, there are some instances where, let's say, you just made some bad lineup choices, and you would have had more points. Like your best lineup every week would have been the most points for. Okay, cool. But again, if you've already made those bad choices, are you going to continue to make bad choices, or are you changing something up to make good choices? Probably if you've made bad choices for 4 weeks, you're probably going to continue to make bad sit start decisions. We talked about this. If they're at week 4, if you're in a 12-team league, you're going to have probably at week 4 10 teams that are that are 2-2 or better, that think they have a shot. You're going to have 2 teams that are 1-3 or 0-4 that are out. Like you said, the earliest dog to the bowl gets the kibble. So the amount of customers you have to sell your picks to is the highest at week 4. Once we get to week 5, week 6, the number of customers starts dropping off because other teams start realizing I don't have a shot at this, and they start selling. And so you talked about this, like the value gets stripped away because there's so many people trying to sell. The supply and demand of the market in your league gets thrown off. So I want to be first to market or second, ideally first or second. I've seen in a league, one of my longest standing dynasty leagues, we had a guy go, "Hey, I was the champ last year and I was runner up the year before." He's like, "I'm 0-2. It's not looking good. I'm willing to sell all my pieces." He's first to market. So now I'm 0-2. I probably need to be second to market because if he's going to sell his veteran wide receiver for a second, I have a veteran wide receiver who's going to give me a second. The number of people that are buying that, it's already gone by 1. And every week you wait, it drops off more and more of the number of customers, that the demand for your aging assets or your viable starters, that number decreases. It's you talked about it off air at the time, that it's a reverse bell curve. It's a U of the number of people just slowly drops off. And then then you get a point where like everyone knows route and they start rebuilding for next year and they're willing to take on some assets, and it picks up literally at the end of the season when at that point you're already done. So are you willing to wait through that valley of that U? So I think week 4, but I'm looking at it now and going, okay, where am I at? Where am I trending? Who am I playing? Who am I playing week 3 and 4? Am I playing the top 2 teams in my league? Because if I'm at 1-1 right now, and I look at 3 and 4, and I'm playing the top 2 teams who are the top 2 highest scorers, and I'm the 8th highest scorer, then I can already see the ratings on the wall.
Here's the thing, though. If you have players with really strong historical profiles, if you've got Mark Andrews, Sam Laporta, yes, Travis Kelce, and Trey McBride, you're doing a bully tight end in a tight end premium league, and you're 0-2 right now, your die has already been cast. There is no reason for you to tear that team down. You're just waiting for regression to come back your way. And so if you have very strong assets, Patrick Mahomes, if you have players that have done this multiple times historically, I would probably persevere a little bit longer. If you're waiting for players to ascend, like Drake London, perhaps, historically somewhere in the wide receiver 30 range, eventually we're assuming he's going to be a top 12 guy. It hasn't happened yet. If it continues not to happen and you have a bunch of Drake London types, that's the type of team where you may want to throw in the towel a little bit earlier than that bully tight end team I just mentioned.
No, I completely agree. I think there's some instances like that, like Mark Andrews or a T. Higgins who hasn't played, who you drafted probably in the 5th round to be your wide receiver 2, who hasn't been playing, but historically has been really good. Or let's say you have a Brandon Ayuk who's underperformed, but realistically didn't practice or play in preseason. Now doesn't have Debo, doesn't have Christian McCaffrey. Like he should see an increase in his volume and productivity going forward. So there are instances like that, but I think in general you have to really look at it, and I think it's a gut check time for people. I do also think we need to dispel some of these myths and connotations of rebuilding. Because for me, rebuilding is not tanking. It's not quitting. It is a multi-year strategy, and that's what Dynasty is set up for. Dynasty is set up for multi-year strategies.
Yep.
I get it. You want people to compete every year. I'm still competing. I'm just competing in a different way. How do you look at rebuilding? Do you see it as quitting and tanking? How do you view it in your mind? Like, what kind of connotation does it have for you?
I've seen contenders that don't make any moves and they continue to win against all odds, right? They don't grind waivers. They set the same lineup every single week. They don't trade. you can be a rebuilder in the same mold, can't you? You can
Yes.
just
Yep.
sort of let your team wither and die and then sort of hope that like a phoenix, it rises again. Or you can be a very active player. And that's what I choose to be when I'm faced with a rebuild. I adopt a lot of orphans. And so the players don't look like players that I typically would want to roster. And so when I'm rebuilding, I'm probably more active than if I'm contending or in the middle, because you need to be a bit of a point guard. You need to extract your 3% tithe on either side of any of these deals, but facilitate deals between contenders because they're loath to trade with each other. So find ways to trade with everybody, right? Including the rebuilders themselves.
Yeah.
I don't mind positioning myself a few different ways throughout the course of a season when I'm rebuilding. Last year, J.K. Dobbins was somebody I was buying in rebuilds. Did I think he was going to be as good as he's been so far this year? Of course not. No, but he was available for a 3rd round pick. And I've always been told when you're rebuilding, don't buy running backs, especially don't buy injured running backs, because, they're just going to be pushed out on a life raft into the ocean. But that's not always the case, is it? If you buy good profiles at distressed prices with a short-term turnaround, I consider 12 months a short-term turnaround for those types of assets. And then you're patient enough to see them come to fruition. Those are the types of things that I'm hunting out in season. And they're going to be frequently cropping up. One question I had for you, Dustin, is let's say that I've been hit with just horrible injury luck and I was a little fragile to begin with. I've got CMC on my roster. What am I supposed to do with these 28, 29, 30-year-old running backs who used to be considered in the top, I don't know, 6 to 12? What am I supposed to do with that right now? Am I waiting until week 9, 10 when he comes back healthy? Am I going to be inclined to hold him throughout the next 10 months, hoping I can open a new contending window?
I mean, that's the hard part because most of your dynasty leagues have some sort of trade deadline. Now, I'm a proponent of not having them, or at least have it at the playoffs. So if you have a trade deadline, you have to realize, like, is Christian McCaffrey coming back before my trade deadline? Is someone willing to buy him? I think Jonathan Brooks is another great name because he was drafted as someone like, oh, I'll just ride it out for the first 5, 6 weeks and I'll get him back and he'll be ready for the playoff run. But if you're
Yeah.
got slammed with injuries, so what do you do with those players? If you look at it and you go, man, I need to sell. And here's the thing, when we say sell, we're not saying sell it for anything you can get. We're saying sell them at market value for your league.
Yeah.
I'm okay selling a Christian McCaffrey right now. Where do I see him long term? You got this is where I think you have to start looking into some of the data. Age, contract, because players around him, did they draft a guy? Which they haven't. I mean, Jordan Mason's there. He wasn't highly drafted. System and fit, like, is he in a system and fit where he's going to continue to see the production? If I have a Christian McCaffrey down, I got hit with injuries and I'm fragile and I'm just not, let's say I'm 0-2. I think I'm selling him. I think I'm going to take what I can, not what I get. I'm going to sell him for market value and just look forward. I think that's the best route because I don't know when he's coming back. I worry that even when he comes back, that calf strain is still going to be a thing. Like
Yeah.
it's calf tendon, Achilles tendonitis. Like those are not. It's not like it's a repaired knee where you just need to like build up the strength. Like that could flare back up at any time. Those kind of injuries scare me. I feel the same way with Kenneth Walker. This is his 5th core muscle injuries. He's had a sports hernia, a pulled groin, 2 abdominal strains, and now he's got an oblique. Like, not saying that he's injury prone, but something is going on in that core of Kenneth Walker that scares me.
Yeah.
And so I'm selling him because I don't want the risk. And I am a risk adverse player. And I think that most people know me, know that I'm a risk adverse player. I'd rather sell Christian McCaffrey and get something back. So if I can sell Christian McCaffrey for a J.K. Dobbins and a pick, like a first, I'm okay with that.
Yeah. On the inverse, here's a move that I made today that I would encourage folks to do, even when they're rebuilding. I had David Montgomery on an orphan team. He doesn't belong on a rebuilder, does he?
No.
Like,
Nope.
Of course not. 28 years old or something like that.
Yeah.
I traded David Montgomery today for Isaiah Pacheco, who is out for 6 to 9 weeks with a broken leg, I think.
Yep.
And I got a 2-3 swap. So I gave up a 3rd round pick. I got a 2nd round pick back.
I like it.
I got a veteran running back for a veteran running back. I opened up somebody's contending window a little bit further. They're still getting points on a weekly basis. I kind of think of Pacheco and Montgomery as the same player, and I got a slight pick upgrade. You don't always have to hunt out the 23-year-old wide receivers. You can wait in the veteran running back market just as effectively as a rebuilder. Like, don't limit yourself to a narrow pool of assets, y'all.
Yeah, and I think we overvalue youth. If you can go from a 28-year-old running back to a 26-year-old running back and pick up a second, like do a pick like you did, a second and third swap, you gained yourself basically 2 years
Mhm.
and you moved up in the round. I think that's a great trade. I do think there's this sense of selling those players and opening up someone else's contending window keeps them on them as a customer longer than if you don't. And
Yep.
I think that's not talked about enough. Or if I can say, hey, you were on the border, here's a couple pieces that make you a contender, that means they're going to continue to buy the next couple weeks. If you strip their assets, then they're no longer going to be, they're going to be a seller and not a buyer. You want to create more buyers in your league and keep those buyers active longer. So I think that was a really smart move.
And the other thing you can do, this manager also has JJ McCarthy, who's on IR. You don't have to get that asset today, knowing that it's still out there. You can wait a few more weeks because I also have Najee Harris on that team. Eventually, I'm anticipating getting JJ McCarthy. I'm going to be grinding the running back waivers still,
Yep.
even though I'm not contending, because you never know when the next Jordan Mason is going to come up where you can flip them for a second, or you can package them into an injured quarterback using a Najee Harris as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's a really good value is right. When you're rebuilding, you need to be grinding waivers and picking up those guys. And even if it's just a super short sell, like you pick them up and you trade them the next week, I think that's okay. Like you need to
Totally.
acquire. We were talking off air that I have a league where we can start 2 quarterbacks and a super flex. So you can start 3. We have a large IR section because we still have it left over from COVID. Anytime my guys go out on Sunday morning, I throw them in the IR and I pick up backup quarterbacks because I know backup quarterbacks will always be sold for a third. So I did it 2 years ago, picked up Colt McCoy, had him on my bench for 2 weeks, then Kyler Murray got injured. I sold him the next day for a third.
Yep.
If I can go out and I can get third round picks off my waiver, I will take them all day.
Yeah. The thing you should be doing is thinking of the bottom half of your rebuilding roster as an extension of the contenders' benches. So look at what the
Yes.
contenders need. It may be short-term wide receivers. You may be able to facilitate that. It may be backup quarterbacks. It may be tight ends. It's certainly running backs. And so what you need to do is look at who are the active contending traders and extend their bench on your roster, and don't try to rake them over the coals. Be a great facilitator. Don't take the max value because, like you said, you want to keep them coming back to you first. You want to be their preferred trade partner. You want to be that point guard.
Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it, is considering the bottom half of your roster as extensions of their benches. That's a really great way of putting it because you are taking going, hey, this guy has Devin Singletary as a flex play. Maybe I need to pick up a Tyrone Tracy or an Eric Gray, like have their handcuffs. This guy has Drake London. Maybe I can pick up Ray McLeod, right? Who, might be the guy if Drake London were to miss a game or two, right? Who's already seen some production. I think that's a really smart way of looking at it. Any other tools or thought process that a rebuilding manager should be thinking about when they're looking at how to rebuild and when to make those calls?
Yeah, just one other thing, and I think it's really relevant to the first couple weeks. Target Monday night games and Monday night players, because you never know when a manager is going to get stranded, and you can feed them a Ray McLeod
Yeah.
because they don't have an AJ Brown anymore. Like they're in a really tough spot. So don't think intentionally about you developing players, quote unquote, developing players. You don't necessarily need Malachi Corley. Sometimes you need Ray McLeod because he's going to provide more utility for yourself and for other managers as well. So just try to have those short-term mindsets, even when you're rebuilding, even when you have a really long view of what success looks like. You have to capitalize on those short-term moments. That needs to be very present in your mind.
Yeah, I look at everything in like a 2 to 3 week window, a 3 to 6 month window, and then a year to 2 window. And that's how I look at all my things. So is this guy someone I can move in the next 2 to 3 weeks? Is this someone whose value is going to change drastically in the next 3 to 6 months? Or is this guy value is going to change in the next year to 6 months to a year? So if I can pick up like a Jordan Travis, who might not have value now, but if Aaron Rodgers were to go down, his value picks up in 3 to 6 months. And then next year, he might just be the starter if Aaron Rodgers retires or runs for office, or who knows what Aaron Rodgers might do. So I think
Yeah.
that's the way I look at it. So I think we've talked about a lot of good topics here of like knowing your skill sets. Like draft picks are not just picks; they're assets that you need to learn. I think we both agree that you need to make decisions earlier rather than later on when to rebuild, if you should rebuild or not. So let's give them a couple players. Who are a quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end that you are actively looking to acquire in a rebuild right now? You
Oh,
are the orphan master.
this just makes me giddy. I love the concept of building players, building these war chests of players up. One that I think is going unnoticed right now is Russell Wilson. Like terrible news all around. Justin Fields is purported to be the starter. I looked at the underlying metrics, and Fields is running really, really hot right now. He's taking way too long to throw. He's not reading the field. He's a see it, throw it guy. He has negative dropped yardage for some reason. Like this is it's working out perfectly right now. And that's not always going to be the case. We know the NFL, the ball bounces a different way every single week. And
Yep.
so I think Russell Wilson is going to have an opportunity. And I think he can be bought for, gosh, a couple of thirds probably, like
Yeah.
in some leagues. And I think you can cash in for a couple of seconds later this year. I think a very short term buy is Russell Wilson. Extending that a little further, Justin Herbert is criminally underrated, undervalued. He's like QB 17 right now. He should be in the top 6 or 8, in my opinion. He's done things that almost no quarterback in the history of the NFL has done so far in his career. He just doesn't have great weapons. Those things change over time. If you're rebuilding and you can extend the runway a little bit, I think Herbert is going to be back up to top 6 production in 2025. Do you have any quarterbacks on your mind?
Yeah, I have a young one. We talked a little bit about JJ McCarthy. I don't think you get him right now, but I think in 3 weeks, when you have a contender that's looking for someone and they go, I need something, you go, give me JJ McCarthy. I think they're willing to trade JJ for pennies on the dollar what he would have been worth 3 months ago, like before his injury. His value has dropped a ton. And I think someone like you're saying with Russell Wilson is Geno Smith. If you believe that Jackson Smith and Jigba is the breakout that he is, we've seen DK Metcalf still be a star. Tyler Lockett is still a serviceable fantasy piece. If all three of those wide receivers are going to be fantasy assets, that has to mean that Geno Smith is a fantasy asset.
Yep.
And yes, he's old, and yes, he probably isn't there next year. But again, like Russell Wilson, you get him now for a third, a fourth, 2/3, and you trade him for a second. 2/3 is worth a second straight up. Like if you were trading just picks, you would trade 2/3 for a second, most cases.
It's also extending that bench, so to speak, again.
Yep.
We know that these quarterback injuries are going to come. There were something like 65 starting quarterbacks last year. We're on track for that again. This is going to happen. Having Geno Smith provides some level of security for contenders. This is a short-term hold for you. You don't have to keep him for the entirety of his career. These buys can be, like you said, 2 to 3 week buys.
Yeah. So I'm looking at Geno Smith. Running backs, it's Jahmyr Gibbs. And I know it sounds crazy to be like, go get Jahmyr Gibbs. Of course you want Jahmyr Gibbs. But Jahmyr Gibbs' value compared to other running backs in his tier, compared to a Bijan, a Breece Hall, a healthy CMC, a Devin A. Chain, Jahmyr Gibbs is considerably cheaper than those guys. And I think he provides the same amount of value, especially long term. So I'm trying to get Jahmyr Gibbs everywhere I can because I think David Montgomery, right? We've talked about him a little bit. He's not going to be around forever.
Yep.
And you can get a guy who I think is a top 5 dynasty running back for cheaper than the rest of the top 5 dynasty running backs.
Yeah, I love that one. Najee Harris is oddly an analytics king, and I think he's undervalued, underrated, and will continue to perform for the next several years. I don't know why he is so cheap right now. Khalil Herbert as well. I think there are really encouraging signs and signals that offense is still developing in Chicago, and we could see Herbert take over that backfield. Right now, he could probably be had for, a 4th round pick, maybe?
Yeah, as not the starter, as the backup, and right, and you even look at long term, Khalil Herbert could be elsewhere. He's on the last year of his deal, I think, or he's got one more year. Like every time a running back goes down, everybody goes, they should call Chicago for Khalil Herbert. It's like, yeah, we know he's good.
Yeah, 2 guys that aren't getting any help from their offensive line, and I think that's probably going to change at some point soon. Tony Pollard and Derrick Henry, some old guys. So if you're somewhere in the middle, you're not sure if you're contending or if you're retooling or rebuilding. These are players that I think are going to have incredible booms over the next month or two. So I'm willing to even buy to that aged cast, saying that, yeah, I'm going to get these guys off my team. I know that they're short-term assets, but they are due some really, really solid positive regression.
I was banging the table for Tony Pollard all offseason because I think everybody wanted. Again, we have this hype for these young rookies and second-year players. Everybody was banging the table for Tajay Spears, that he's explosive, and that system to me always looked like it was a one running back system, which is what they did in Cincinnati. They paid Tony Pollard. They did not draft Tajay Spears. They chose Tony Pollard. They have the same skill set. They said, okay, we're gonna pay someone who has the same skill sets as the young guy we have. So I was like, it's Tony Pollard. I told someone on a podcast before the season that I think it was going to be an 80-20 split, and it's looking close to that right now after 2 weeks. Tony Pollard is a great buy right now, and I think you're going to get 2 years out of him.
Yeah.
Or he could be a first round trade value in 2-3 weeks,
Mm-hmm. The
especially with
thing
the injuries
is,
we've seen.
yeah, with running back injuries, it's even worse than quarterback, isn't it, Dustin? Like
Yeah.
half of the top 24 running backs coming into the season miss at least 4 games. So
Mm-hmm.
we just have to be ready to sell. And in order to sell, you have to have some of these assets on your roster. I know it sounds counterintuitive to trade for old running backs, but like I said, you want to have as wide a net as possible,
Yeah.
understanding that like we're still months away from the non-point scoring season. We don't need to have the young guys just yet. We can hold off a little bit longer on that.
I agree. What about wide receivers? Do you have a wide receiver that you're targeting?
Can I say Deontay Johnson? I mean, he has 0.68 yards per route run. He's historically a 1.8 yards per route run guy. Like he's been buried in so many terrible offenses. I think this is a good wide receiver who is not long for Carolina. I know he just got there, but could you imagine him in a decent offense? This is a buy low to me. I can't believe that I'm saying it. 28-year-old Deontay Johnson still hasn't found a quarterback.
Well, I will say it is spooky season, so you are allowed to mention Deontay Johnson because that name scares the living daylights out of me. I have a young guy in Jalen Polk for the Patriots, who I think the future is just bright for him. So if you're looking for a long-term asset, but I think everyone should be buying Rashee Rice right now.
Wow.
His value is still depressed, especially in Dynasty because of the looming suspension. Now, it's not going to happen until next year. We know that. Or at worst, it's December. Maybe he misses the real playoffs, but not your fantasy playoffs. I think Rashee Rice, and I said this on the podcast, that this year Rashee Rice is 2 years ago Amon-Ra St. Brown, where it was he's posed for huge volume, huge breakout. Like he's going to be a guy that's just going to, and he's on a great offense. His value is still depressed because people are looming about the suspension and wondering what it's going to be, and especially in Dynasty because they're going, well, I'm not going to get him for 6 games next year, so I'll sell him cheap, and I don't have to deal with that headache or whatever. Go get Rashee Rice right now. Like you're going to get tons of production right now, and again, his value is just going to go up, and I think it's just going to continue to go up as the season goes on because he's going to continue to produce. And we've seen it. Like they were like, oh, Juju's going to come in, and Hollywood Brown. Now Hollywood Brown's on IR. Like his opportunities have just increased. So I think his relative value, what it should be, is so high, and his current market value is so low.
Yeah, the demand is certainly high for Rice. I wonder what it would take to pry away a share of Rashee Rice from the existing manager. If you can, I certainly see 8 to 12 dynasty valuation somewhere in that tier. So if you can get him today, you're going to get the production and the value bump, which is pretty nice.
Yeah, so I always like to use Alex Korf peaked in high school at Draft Sharks, his trade guides. His August dynasty trade values for Rashee Rice puts him at 38 points, which is a 26 first or just after the 2025 first. But you're looking at guys of Montgomery, Derrick Henry. He's in the running back groups with Evans. Jordan Addison was there, but obviously hasn't been updated. Keenan Allen, who was there, Jaden Reed, Christian Kirk, Calvin Ridley, Stephon Diggs, Terry McLaurin. I just think his value is still depressed to what it should be. I think he should be up in that next tier with your Debos and your T. Higgins and your Zay Flowers and your Jackson Smith and Jigbas and your DK Metcalfs and your Michael Pittmans. That's where I think he should be.
If not much higher. I think he
If
has
not much
ceiling
higher,
well
yeah.
above that. Yeah. Yeah, I think
I like I said, I think he is the Amon-Ra St. Brown from 2 years ago, where you were like, he's a borderline top 12 guy, but I don't know. And you're just like, maybe. And then
yeah.
all of a sudden, Amon-Ra Brown's like a top 5 guy. So I'm willing to buy a guy. I'm willing to buy a guy that's currently valued at top 24, who I think can be a top 10 guy.
Yeah, a rookie to buy on the way up. I mean, Brian Thomas Jr. has all of the metrics of an elite alpha wide receiver. He just isn't getting enough snap share right now. He needs to
Oh.
increase it by about 15 to 20%. But you look at his first downs per route run, his first read target share, his yards per route run. It's in line with the very best rookie seasons that we've ever seen. I know there's some great wide receivers in this rookie class. Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors had something like a 50% first read target share last week. I mean, he's unbelievable. And it's disguising what Brian Thomas Jr. is, which is an incredibly good wide receiver that probably should be bought on the way up.
Yeah, the only problem is he has hot trash Trevor Lawrence throwing him the ball, so
Hey, now.
that's the problem. That's the only problem with him. What about a tight end that you think rebuilding dynasty managers should go get? You got a tight end for him?
So it's going to be really difficult to get Brock Bowers right now. He's somebody that we probably should have bought more heavily into in week one. If you can right now, please do so. If you can't, go for last year's ascending tight end, Sam Laporta. He's only getting 9% of the first read target share right now. It's going to Jamison Williams. It's going to Amon-Ra St. Brown. I think this is going to normalize over time. I think he's going to get back to 20 to 25%, just like he was last year. He ran hot with touchdowns last year, and that's why he finished as tight end one. But Sam Laporta is legitimately a great tight end. He is a very young George Kittle. That's what he is. If he has that type of career, I would be thrilled. Right now, there's a dip in his value. If you look at sites like KTC, the little spike is going in a downward direction. And I really like buying elite profiles when that happens. And I think he is accessible because a lot of tight ends have really not put up very good production, him included. Get one while you can.
Yeah, people are panicking. I'll give you a dark horse name, and I think it's Chigakonkwo for the Titans. I know Will Levis has made some boneheaded mistakes. I'm hoping he turns it around so my perfume, my Will Levis mayonnaise perfume, it goes up in value. But Chigakonkwo has the production. DeAndre Hopkins is older. Christian Kirk is just, or Calvin Ridley's just okay. Tyler Boyd's older. I think Will Levis will get John. I think Chigakonkwo can be a Dallas Goedert type player on your team, a Zach Ertz type player on your team where he's good enough. He's never going to be a top 5 guy, but I think he can be a borderline tight end, top 12 guy. And I think he's right there and he'll have some spike weeks. I think he's a great guy to go get. So I'm getting Chigakonkwo.
He was a analytics darling just a few years ago, 3.0 yards per route run, just an efficiency monster, waiting for the right opportunity, waiting for the tight end funnel to occur. I have doubts about Levis, but if Levis isn't good and you're a rebuilding team, that means a new quarterback is coming.
Yes, and we know that rookie quarterbacks don't favor the tight end, but they do look for a safety valve. And some teams that's the running back, some teams it is the tight end. And I think for Tennessee, it will be the tight end. And Chigakonkwo catches all of his passes. He just has sure hands, which I think I really like. So that's how we look at rebuild. We gave you some names. Before we get out of here, let's do not necessarily a draft, but give me 4 teams, Tommy, 4 NFL teams that you just want to see win a Super Bowl. Who are those teams you're like, man, I just want them to win one?
Just want them to win one. So I'm going to let my fandom come straight out. I'm a Jacksonville Jaguars fan, and
sorry,
it has been a rough ride. I've been a fan since 1995, since the first game. And if I could see them win one Super Bowl before I leave this earth, that would be just unbelievable. Bucket list item checked off. I'm just going to keep going if that's okay. I'm going to hog
go for it.
Great. I really like the new Washington Commanders leadership. I think that what they're doing is more difficult than an expansion team, turning around not just a team, but a culture. And I'm really intrigued by Jaden Daniels. He's someone that seems easy to root for. I would love if he could get a Super Bowl. Same with the LA Chargers, sort of the second cousin, nobody really likes them. They have a small fan base as well, but Justin Herbert is so easy to root for again, just a down to earth guy. He goes fishing. He avoids the cameras. He does his thing. I never really bought into the he can't be a leader because he's not vocal narrative in his rookie year. And he's just gone out and proven so many people wrong. I'm an Oregon Ducks fan as well. That doesn't hurt. What about you, though? What teams would you like to see in the Super Bowl?
I mean, obviously, my first choice is my Buffalo Bills. I want one before I turn 40, 42 or 43 this October. I'm getting really worried that we're not going to see one before I die, which is my pessimistic view on things. So I want them to win one. My dad's from Detroit. I have a lot of family. I'm actually headed out there in a couple weeks for my uncle's funeral. I want the Lions to win one. I love Jared Goff, always have. I love Jahmyr Gibbs. I like Sam Laporta. I think Dan Campbell is a great motivator of men. Maybe not the best X's and O's coach, but I like what he's building there in culture. I'm a big believer in building culture, and I think he's done great. Texans, I like Tank Dell a lot. I like CJ Stroud. I like what they do. I like what they're building down there in H-Town. They're such a fun team. I would love to see them. And then for some reason, I just want to see the Seattle Seahawks win another one. Like I know
Yeah.
they've won one, but it's been so long, and I feel like their Super Bowls get forgotten. Like you forget that Russell Wilson went to 2 in a row, like back to back, won one and lost one because of the Patriots. Like they're just forgotten about. Like, and that team was so bad for so long. Finally had some good years with Russell Wilson, and then it's almost like, oh yeah, I forgot they won a Super Bowl. Like there was a talk of how many Hall of Famers are currently playing quarterbacks, and I said Russell Wilson. Like I was like, he's won a Super Bowl. Like he did. I'm like, yeah. Do you not remember? Like, oh yeah. It's like they just forget. I would love to see. Maybe it's not, probably not Geno Smith, but I think Tyler Lockett is an outstanding person in terms of like what he does. They're building a young core. I think Jackson Smith and Jigba is a nice guy. Like I think it'd be just fun to see Seattle win something. You know, they just don't win very often in any sports. So I would love to see a Super Bowl there in Seattle.
One final one. I would love it if Justin Jefferson, specifically with the Minnesota Vikings, could have a Larry Fitzgerald type playoff run and have a Super Bowl victory. Do you remember that Arizona run where Fitzgerald had something like 550 yards in 4 games? I could see Jefferson taking over an entire playoffs and sort of captivating the NFL landscape for a month.
Hey, I'll take it next year with JJ McCarthy. I mean, I think that'd be great. I think you're right. I think Jefferson is starving for one, and he wants to dominate. He wants to be in the conversation with Jerry Rice and Randy Moss and Larry Fitzgerald's like, I'm the greatest wide receiver ever. And I think he could dominate a playoff run. I think you're right. I think that would be a lot of fun. I think it'd be a lot of fun if it was like him and Jamar Chase in the same playoffs, like battling out. Like, I want to get paid 1 cent higher than you. I'm going to go score one more yard than you. I could totally see that would be a great Super Bowl. Minnesota, Cincinnati Super Bowl, I think would be phenomenal. So
yeah, you heard it here first, y'all. That would be a great
there you
Super
go.
Bowl.
That would be a great Super Bowl. Well, Tommy, thanks for coming in and talking rebuilding, giving some of our listeners some solid advice of when they should make the decision to rebuild, what that looks like, and kind of dispelling some of the myths on rebuilding. Before we get out of here, tell everybody where they can find you and what you got going on.
Yeah, Dustin, again, thank you for having me on. It was great to catch up with you again to talk football. I'm Tommy Blair at FF Tommy B on Twitter. We've got a Discord for the Superflex Super Show. Episodes dropping really twice a week in season. We've got waivers, ads, drops, trade fours, and aways early in the week. And then we talk strategy later in the week. It comes out on Fridays. We're going to have some really great guests on. Dustin, I'd love to have you on. Let's put the on-air pressure on you.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'll come on anytime. You set a date, I'll be there.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, so keep an eye out for Dustin joining us on the Superflex Super Show.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. If you're watching this, drop a comment. We'd love to continue this conversation. If you have questions on whether or not you should be rebuilding, hit up me, hit up Tommy, drop a comment on the YouTube. We'd love to help you guys make that decision and help you kind of get some one-on-one advice. My DMs are always open at the D Unit 13. Follow Bridge the Gap. Hit that like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week.